Welcome back to the Patronus Pages. Today we will be doing another reading from the Many Deaths of Harry Potter. Chapter 59, Ahead. That wasn't well done, Dumbledore said quietly. Slughorn was back in his home, unaware that they'd even visited. As far as Harry was concerned, it was a win for all of them. He wouldn't be asked about something he didn't even know, and he couldn't betray them either. Harry frowned. What else could we have done? Got him to teach at the school and then waited for most of a year while we tried to wear him down? That would have been the kinder choice. They were back in Dumbledore's study, the fire crackling quietly. It was darker than usual, or maybe it was Harry's mood making everything seem darker. It would have been a stupid choice, a Gryffindor choice, more concerned with looking heroic than actually saving people. Harry shook his head. Sometimes the pragmatic thing really is the best way. He couldn't have done it if Dumbledore hadn't stopped him after all, and Slughorn has been his friend. Dumbledore had known it was necessary just as much as Harry had. He might not have liked the methods, but he absolutely needed the results. Besides, Harry said, he won't remember it. We'll fix his mistake, and he'll be able to tell himself that it all worked out in the end. I had rather hoped to get him to teach independent of all of this, Dumbledore said mildly. Harry shook his head. Did you see the condition he was in? He'd be as bad as Quirrell was in first year, except he wouldn't be pretending. He'd not the man you knew before. The fear and trauma of what had happened to him had obviously made him afraid of his own shadow. Harry was both sympathetic toward that and not. He understood fear intimately, but he believed that the only way to conquer fear was to fight back. That was the only way to find some measure of control. Dumbledore cleared his throat. We now know that there is a limit to the number of horcruxes he could have made. My guess is that he made one less than the maximum, Harry said. At Dumbledore's look, he hurried to explain. He's terrified of death, and what is having your soul completely dissolve but a form of death? He wouldn't want to chance it. Making you a horcrux likely has made him less stable, Dumbledore said, his soul on the verge of dissolution. For a moment, Harry imagined himself tricking Voldemort into making that last horcrux. The man would simply dissolve on his own. If it didn't require a murder, and it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't figure out a way to convince Voldemort to do it, Harry would have been enthusiastic about the plan. Me and the book make two, Harry said. How will we figure out what and where the others are? The sheer impossibility of the task was almost overwhelming. If it had been Harry, he'd have created horcruxes out of common items while making fake horcruxes. If he didn't need to retrieve them for some reason, he'd have dropped at least one of them into the depths of the ocean. If he did need them, he'd have put them in places only he could find. Behind a wall in a random muggle house, inside of a statue that had nothing to do with him at all. He'd have thrown darts at a map on the wall and buried the horcruxes wherever the dart landed. He would keep one near him always, Dumbledore said, his fingers tented together before him, so that even if the others were destroyed, he could keep it protected. The snake, Harry said. I didn't see any kind of locket or pendant around the infant Voldemort, and he certainly didn't have anything on when he was resurrected. I agree, it would serve as a vessel to hold his spirit and a protector, Dumbledore said. Wouldn't that mean the snake was made after he tried to kill me as a baby? Harry asked. Dumbledore nodded. I believe he intended to use your murder to create the last horcrux. He always had an ego. It would tickle his sense of irony to use the death of his greatest foe to secure his own immortality. So, what about the others? Harry asked. He always admired the founders of Hogwarts, Slytherin the most, of course, but the others as well. I believe that he would have attempted to use the artifacts most associated with them to create his immortality. So that's 4, Harry said. Dumbledore shook his head. He had no access to Gryffindor's sword. I know where that is. However, Hufflepuff's cup, Slytherin's locket, and Ravenclaw's diadem are all things he would have coveted. So we know all but one of the items, Harry said glumly. He only needs one to stay here forever, like a stain on a muggle carpet. Worse, we have no way of knowing where any of the others are. I believe he would have placed the items in places of personal significance to him. Dumbledore said. "It is possible that we shall stumble across the last item in one of those places." Harry nodded shortly. It was a hope, at least as vague as it was. "I will contemplate possible locations," Dumbledore said, "and we will discuss going together to find them." If it hadn't been for his rest ability, Harry doubted that Dumbledore would have bothered to keep him in the loop. With it, however, he'd be foolish not to include him. After all, even someone like Dumbledore could be caught unawares and killed, and if it had been Harry, he'd have protected his horcruxes with the nastiest traps and spells that he knew. "Perhaps we will do better tomorrow with fresher heads," Dumbledore said. Harry nodded shortly. It wouldn't do to have Malfoy or one of the others to notice that he'd been out unusually late to his detention. "Tomorrow, then," he said. The next few days settled back into a routine. The final task of the Triwizard Tournament wasn't for almost another 4 months, and the furor over his saving of Fleur's sister and Cho Chang gradually started to die down. Most people seemed to believe that it had simply been some sort of mistake. That was the Ministry line, after all. According to the Ministry, it had been human error that had caused the girls almost to die, not sabotage. That didn't stop the Daily Prophet from lambasting the Auras, calling them incompetent for responding so slowly, for not double-checking the girls. Still, from the perspective of the Ministry, incompetence was better than sabotage. Cho Chang seemed embarrassed every time she saw Harry. Probably the memory of hurling into his face was embedded in her mind. It had been projected onto massive screens for everyone to see after all. The lessons in occlumency continued, and Harry continued his lessons in combat with Moody. He was getting better and better. Moody no longer had to hold back as much as he had in the past, even the first time Harry had worked for him. Hermione worked on occlumency with the kind of mania Harry usually associated with himself. She was learning it faster than he had too. It surprised him not because he doubted her capabilities, but because he hadn't thought she had the personality for it. It shouldn't have surprised him, though. She always wanted to know everyone else's secrets, but she wasn't nearly as open as Neville with her own secrets. In a way, he wouldn't have been surprised to see her in Slytherin. She was ambitious, clever, and cunning. She was ferociously loyal, and she had a certain vindictive streak that Harry fully approved of. She was a planner, cautious and willing to lie in wait and plot her next move. She didn't have the normal rash and reckless nature of a Gryffindor. Neville oddly seemed more of a Gryffindor than she did, although he wasn't the glory-seeker that most of them were. Harry wondered just how many of Hermione's Slytherin traits had already existed, and how many of them had rubbed off on her from exposure to him. After all, the personality someone had at 11 changed. He had no doubt that some Gryffindors became more Slytherin and vice versa. The day was coming rapidly when he would have to have the discussion he'd been dreading. Anticipating the discussion had his stomach in knots, because while telling Dumbledore had carried the possibility of personal danger, the odds had never been very high. Dumbledore had chosen to back him, and Harry suspected that he'd have to do something fairly horrible for that to change. As long as Dumbledore could tell himself that Harry was better than the alternative, Harry suspected that he would be allowed a great deal of leeway. If that changed, well, Harry would have to be worse than Voldemort, which would be a horrible fate in itself. Learning what had happened to him would change Hermione. It had fundamentally changed Harry, and even learning about it second-hand would damage her in ways he couldn't predict. He feared it would change the way she saw him as well. Neville, at least, wasn't doing at all well in occlumency. Hermione hadn't shared the reason she was so determined to learn it, which meant that he didn't have the same motivation that he had. He didn't have her native intelligence or magical ability, even though he wasn't the duffer he'd thought himself to be. It would be easy to tell Hermione without telling Neville. He might not have a choice if Neville couldn't master occlumency. It was Harry's second detention with Snape in a week. People were beginning to notice. Usually Snape had a policy of ignoring Harry, but this week he'd found reasons to be more critical of him. Hermione and Neville were both concerned, but Harry assured them that nothing had happened between him and the professor. In truth, Dumbledore had decided on searching out a promising location and wanted Harry to go with him. The detention ruse wouldn't hold forever, not if these things were to be common events, but they would do for the short term. "So you aren't sure we'll find anything?" Harry asked as they hurried quietly through the streets of Little Hangleton. Dumbledore was beside him. He'd cast disillusionment spells on both of them so that Harry wouldn't have to use his cloak, and spells to muffle their voices, but he'd still encouraged Harry to speak quietly. He shook his head and said, "I've been studying the course of Tom's life since before you were born. I believe that retracing the steps to places important to him will be the first place to look for hidden horcruxes." Harry nodded. "So why is this place important?" "It is the place where his mother grew up," Dumbledore said. "It seemed prudent to start at the very beginning." They passed a set of trees, and the house came into view. It was halfway concealed by tangled trunks. The trees blocked out the light and would have prevented any kind of a view of the valley below. The walls were moss-covered, and rafters were visible from holes in the roof, even as tiles lay fallen on the ground. The whole place looked as though it had been deserted for longer than Harry had been alive. Nettles grew up along the walls, reaching up to tiny, grime-encrusted windows. It didn't look like the kind of place Tom Riddle would have been proud to admit to living in. Compared to the wizarding houses Harry had seen before, it actually seemed rather modest. Even the Dursleys would have turned their noses up at it. It looked like a good wind would have blown the entire place down if it hadn't been supported by the trees. "We must be careful," Dumbledore said. "I have no doubt that if this truly is a repository for a Horcrux, there will be fearsome spells. Stay behind me and don't touch anything." Normally, Harry would have protested that he wasn't incompetent. Although he was physically only 14, he was mentally almost 2 years older than that. He was at least as skilled as a 6th year in things related to combat, and more likely a 7th year. However, he knew nothing about curse-breaking, a skill he was seeing now that he would need to rectify. After all, what better way to kill someone than send them a cursed item or put a curse on the toilet in the loo? "I'll be careful," Harry said. As they reached the perimeter, Dumbledore began casting a complex series of spells, far beyond anything Harry had ever heard of. Apparently there were warning spells that would alert Voldemort if the perimeter was breached. "Walk closely behind me," Dumbledore said after almost 10 minutes, "and don't stray from the path." Harry was careful to follow his instructions to the letter, even trying to step where Dumbledore had stepped. He focused on that so much that he almost ran into Dumbledore's back as he stopped at the front door. The desiccated remains of a dead snake were nailed to the front door. Whether it as a warning or a decoration, Harry didn't know, but Dumbledore began another 10 minutes of spell casting. It was a little frustrating for Harry. He wasn't used to sitting or standing in this case and doing nothing. He kept his time well occupied. He was either studying, training, or occasionally spending time with his friends. The times where he simply did nothing didn't exist. So he found himself fidgeting. He didn't begrudge Dumbledore his caution. If he was right, setting off an alarm would be disastrous for many reasons. If they were killed and the alarm was set off, Voldemort would move all of his Horcruxes, and then they'd never find them. Even if they weren't killed, the same result was likely. The door clicked, and a moment later it swung open. Harry peered around Dumbledore to see that the inside was, if anything, even worse than the outside. It was small and cramped. It was dilapidated, and it was filled with filth, the dust of a lifetime of neglect and the droppings of numerous animals. In fact, one corner had numerous animal skeletons. It looked as though the animals had simply dropped dead. There were still a few fresh pigeon corpses. The fact that all the corpses were in one corner of the room was suspicious in and of itself. The fact that there were piles of dead ants around the bodies, apparently killed as they tried to reach them, only increased Harry's conviction that something deadly was in that corner of the room. Dumbledore glanced at Harry, and he didn't have to warn him. If the path outside had been dangerous, whatever was in here would be deadly. Harry found himself regretting coming. It was frustrating not knowing what would happen if he simply stepped into the wrong place. The fact that the corner was obviously dangerous didn't mean that there weren't other traps in the room, something Dumbledore proved as he took a cautious step forward, only to step hurriedly back as something barely visible slashed through the space where he had been. Wand in his hand, Harry watched to see if there was some kind of guardian that they couldn't see. They were disillusioned and could see each other, but Harry assumed that was a special property of the magic that Dumbledore had used. It didn't mean that they could see anyone else who was disillusioned. Dumbledore's wand slashed down, and a single golden line of force appeared in front of them. A set of complicated movements of his wand, and the line twisted and bent, lifting in a section so that they could walk under it. Pointing silently at the floor, Dumbledore pointed at another line that Harry hadn't noticed. He stepped over it, and Harry very carefully did the same. He felt sweat beading at his brow. He was sure that Dumbledore would have done this more easily by him himself. He wouldn't have had to spend time or energy looking out after Harry. Nevertheless, he didn't act as though he was annoyed or put out by Harry's presence, so Harry was determined to be the least trouble possible. Reaching the edge of the line where the dead ants were gathered, Dumbledore shook his head and began mumbling incantations. Harry suspected it would be a long time again. Apparently, Dumbledore was emphasizing caution over speed, a sentiment that he agreed with entirely. Dumbledore pointed his wand, and a moment later the floorboards began to levitate, pulled from the joists in the floor. Harry could see a metal box in the dirt under the floor. "If you would," Dumbledore murmured. Harry nodded. Waving his wand, he levitated the box, floating it toward Dumbledore. When it passed the line, Dumbledore checked the box carefully before touching it. A simple spell opened the lock, and inside was a ring. It was a golden ring set with a black stone. "Tom wore this ring," Dumbledore said, "all throughout school." He picked it up, and Harry let the box drop slowly to the floor. It surprised him that Dumbledore hadn't checked the ring more before touching it, but he assumed that when he was checking the box, he must have checked the enchantments on the ring. "He had no idea of what he really had, though," Dumbledore said softly. "I didn't until later." "What did he have?" Harry asked. He didn't like the look in Dumbledore's eyes. There was a strange sort of greed there, one that looked out of place on a face that usually displayed calmness or quiet amusement. "Have you ever heard of the Deathly Hallows?" Dumbledore asked quietly. Harry frowned. There was a story Neville had told them, some kind of pure-blood fable. Something about 3 brothers avoiding death, right? Dumbledore nodded. "And 3 artifacts were left behind. Most believe they are legend, but I know it to be the truth. There was a cloak of invisibility that has been passed down through the ages." A significant glance down at the pack Harry was carrying. His cloak? It was the one in the story. "There was an elder wand," Dumbledore said. He held up his wand, and Harry noticed for the first time that it was different from the other wands he had seen. It had carvings down the length of it, and it was made from a kind of wood that Harry had never seen. Dumbledore carried a wand that had been gifted by Death himself. "Finally, there is the Resurrection Stone," Dumbledore said. "It is said to be able to raise shades of the dead so long as it is held." "Like ghosts?" Harry asked. "More than ghosts," Dumbledore said, "but less than alive." Harry stared at the stone. What would he say to Colin or Adrian if he could bring them back, even for a little while? Would he tell them he was sorry? Would he thank them for everything they had meant to him? Would they even remember him? Harry knew what dying was like, but he had no idea of what it was like to actually be dead. Did the dead experience time in the same way those alive did? Did they even remember those they'd left behind? What happened afterwards? He could understand Dumbledore's greed. After all, the answer to some of those questions might calm his fears about dying permanently. Harry blinked as he saw Dumbledore slip the ring onto his finger. "Are you stupid?" Harry blurted out, but it was too late. A blackness was already spreading up Dumbledore's arm as he frantically spoke incantation after incantation. Harry felt helpless and overwhelmed. He didn't know any kind of magic to stop this, and what Dumbledore was doing barely seemed to be slowing it down. He took a step back, unsure of what to do. "I fear I have made a mistake," Dumbledore said heavily. "We need to get out. Harry!" Harry looked down. He'd stepped backward into the line of light that had been illuminated by Dumbledore's spell. He felt a sudden sharp pain as his foot was cleanly amputated. He screamed, and as he fell back, he felt a sharp pain in his neck. He'd hit the top line as he fell, he realized. The world suddenly began to tumble around him, everything confused as jumbled. He could no longer feel anything, but as he rolled to a stop, he could see his body falling heavily to the ground. The heavy, shocked rasp of Dumbledore's breathing was the only sound that Harry could hear, and even that was quickly fading. His vision began to grow dark. He only hoped that next time they'd be able to get ahead. Chapter 60. Oblivion. Harry gagged as he felt something horrid enter his mouth. Instinctively, his head jerked back, and it took him a moment to realize that Cho Chang was in front of him. He was back in the water during the second task. He forced his head back to hers so that the bubble of air around his head enveloped them both. He'd have to ask Dumbledore about how to cast the spell on other people. A moment later, he felt the explosions in the water as the auras appeared. As they swam toward him, he thought he saw a distortion in the water behind them. It was difficult to tell. The bubble around his head itself distorted things a little. Before he could say anything, he felt himself being grabbed by auras, and a moment later he was on the floor of Madame Pumphrey's hospital wing. Harry's hand was spasming, and it took him a moment to remember why. He'd used a shocking spell in the water. He'd remember not to do that again, although he supposed there were situations where it might be useful. Getting a lot of Death Eaters to wade through water. He waved Madame Pumphrey away, and she rushed over to help Cho Chang, who was probably a little worse off than she'd been the first time, since Harry had pulled away from her, letting her choke on more water. Watching them take care of her, though, Harry had the sense that things were going to be all right for her, even so. Fleur's sister appeared a moment later, being carried by two auras. He wondered about the distortion he'd seen in the water. It hadn't shown up on any of the cameras used to film the scene for the spectators, or someone would have commented about it. He suspected that it had been someone using a disillusionment spell. Those were more difficult to use in the water than in air. It was possible that the person had just been out of the range of the cameras. That would mean that they knew enough about the position of the cameras to ignore them. Everyone had assumed that one of the auras had been imperioed, but it was possible that nothing had been wrong with the girls when they were checked. Harry gestured frantically toward one of the auras, a man he'd seen last time but still didn't recognize. "I saw someone down there," he said. "Disillusioned, but badly. They might still be down there." The aura nodded. He visibly tried to apparate, but nothing happened. Apparently Dumbledore had reinstated the wards that prevented people from moving freely about Hogwarts. After all, that could have been Voldemort's plan all along. Harm the girls, and when Dumbledore lowered the shields to apparate help in, apparate whoever he wanted onto school grounds. The truth was, it could have already been done, and if no one found it, Harry would have no way of knowing. The limitations of his ability were frustrating. However, this time Harry had woken immediately, as he had all the times with the exception of the last. There had been no sensation of wrongness, and no awareness of the passage of time. Did this mean that Voldemort hadn't gone back with him? Harry wasn't sure. All he did know was that he felt suddenly optimistic. If Voldemort no longer knew what was going to happen, then did that mean he finally had the advantage again? Had it not happened because the Voldemort of this time didn't have his blood? Could he inject his blood into Dumbledore or Hermione or someone else and bring them with him? There were so many questions that had to be answered, and he wasn't sure that even Dumbledore would be able to answer them. The one thing he knew was that he needed to go to Dumbledore sooner than later. He'd be sure to share his latest memory. After all, how often did he get to call Dumbledore stupid and be justified? As Dumbledore's face came out of the water, it was white as a sheet. He dealt with Harry's death better than potentially seeing his own. "If you try to put the ring on again, I'm cutting off your hand," Harry said. "I didn't the last time because I thought you might be able to get it under control, but it didn't look like it." He'd already given Dumbledore the memories of his previous deaths. This last one had affected him much more intensely. Dumbledore shook his head, and with a wave of his hand, his face and head were dry. He staggered to his chair and sat down. "It's odd to see yourself doing something you can't remember," Dumbledore said. "I can't believe you were so stupid as to put the thing on," Harry said. "You had to know it'd be trapped." Normally, Harry would have never called the headmaster stupid, at least not to his face, but under the circumstances he felt it was entirely justified. Dumbledore sat silently, staring into nothing for almost a minute. Finally, he spoke. "Have you ever had something you regret, Harry?" Dumbledore didn't look at Harry. He simply stared off into space. "Something you'd give anything to change, but even with your remarkable circumstances were unable to do so." Adrian and Colin's faces flashed across his mind for a moment, and Harry nodded reluctantly. "You've had losses," Dumbledore said. "I know, I've been watching. But those were the losses of people you'd known for months at most. Imagine they were family, people you'd known your entire life and loved. How much more powerful would the temptation be?" "Can you destroy the Horcrux without destroying the stone?" Harry asked. Dumbledore shook his head. "It's impossible to know without trying again." Glancing at the clock on the wall, Harry said, "Why not now? We haven't spent as much time discussing everything as we did last time, and I'm not eager to discover that I was wrong, and Tom came back with me again and moves the stone. If this changes, our problems will go far beyond that," Dumbledore said. Harry nodded grimly. Keeping Voldemort in the dark was their only chance of winning. They had to destroy every Horcrux. Leaving even one would be a victory for Voldemort and the Death Eaters. All he had to do was successfully save one. "Let's go," Harry suggested. Knowing exactly what to expect didn't make the experience of waiting any easier. It was more nerve-wracking, actually, because Harry was aware of just what the previously invisible lines of light behind him were capable of. It was simple and effective. There weren't even Muggle-repelling spells outside, probably because they would draw attention. The other factor was likely that Tom didn't care if Muggles actually died here. Given his attitudes toward them, it wasn't surprising. Dumbledore was taking just as long this time as he did the last time. Harry suspected that he was being even more careful for fear that something might have changed. It wouldn't do to get overconfident. Levitating the ring from the box, Dumbledore slipped it into another container. He made as though to drop the box back into the dirt when Harry put his hand on his arm. "Why not transfigure a copy?" Harry asked. "He's likely to come check on them at some point, and he might not check very closely. It might buy them some time at least." Dumbledore nodded. He levitated the skeleton of a lizard, and a moment later a copy of the ring was dropped back into the box. The box went back into the dirt under the floor, and the floorboards went back into place. He even managed to restore the dust as they left. "There won't be any residual magic he can detect?" Harry asked. "Not if it's not within the next 3 days," Dumbledore said. "And as far as I know, he hasn't regained his form yet." Harry nodded. Voldemort was hardly likely to take anyone else with him while he checked on the parts of his soul. As an infant, he couldn't do it on his own. They were likely safe for at least as long as Voldemort remained incomplete. Of course, that was why Harry felt time was of the essence. The potion that was part of the ritual that was going to resurrect Voldemort had to take a long time, or he would have been back already. However, Harry knew it would be ready by the end of the third task, which meant they only had slightly less than 4 months to find as many Horcruxes as possible. "Maybe I'd better hold on to the ring," Harry said as he stepped carefully between the bent lines of light. Dumbledore followed him and had to be even more careful because he was taller. "You don't trust me?" Harry shook his head. "Slughorn said that becoming too emotionally invested in the object that the Horcrux is inside can let the portion of soul inside possess you, like Tom possessed Ginny Weasley." "I'm capable of protecting myself for a few minutes," Dumbledore said shortly. A wave of his wand, and the lines of light became invisible again. Another wave, and their tracks in the dust vanished. Everything looked as it had been the moment they'd arrived. As the door closed behind him, Harry felt a surge of relief. A moment later they were heading carefully off the property until they could get far enough away to apparate away without setting off any wards. They apparated to a safe house Dumbledore kept, and from there used the flue to go back to Dumbledore's office. Dumbledore began to examine the ring almost from the moment they arrived back. It was almost 10 minutes before he finally looked up. Nasty, nasty. The curse on this ring is insidious and incurable. I do believe you have saved my life, Harry. How are we going to destroy it? Harry asked. According to Slughorn, the main soul wouldn't feel the destruction of the horcruxes, which meant there was no reason to hold on to them. The horcruxes were dangerous to hold on to anyway, as they could have a deleterious effect on the people closest to them. Harry would hate to see Snape under the influence of one, and considering that he met with the headmaster in this office every day, it likely wouldn't be safe for the students. Dumbledore nodded grimly. He pulled a box from the shelf after waving his wand at it in an intricate manner. Your endeavour with Severus during your second year was profitable for the school, Dumbledore said. I took the liberty of holding some of the venom for an occasion just like this. Harry still had venom hidden in the depths of his vaults as well. Opening the box carefully, Dumbledore turned and pulled out a pair of dragonhide gloves from a desk drawer. Harry peered inside the box and saw a familiar fang lying inside. Apparently, even after all this time, the venom in and on the fang remained potent. Dumbledore stared at the gloves and then at the ring for a long moment before he sighed. He turned and handed the gloves to Harry. It might be better for you to do this, he said at last. Harry wasn't sure whether this was because of Dumbledore's reluctance to destroy the Resurrection Stone or out of fear of some last trap that might prove to be lethal when the Horcrux was destroyed. Either way, Harry had a vague feeling that he should be offended. Instead, he felt a sense of weary resignation. He slipped the gloves on, then glanced at Dumbledore for permission before he took the fang. He was very careful as he did so. Killing himself by being careless would be exhausting and embarrassing. Of course, if he did die from his own stupidity, he might just admit that when he told Dumbledore what was happening the next time. The problem was that he would remember his own stupidity. So what do I do? Harry asked. Just stab it? Dumbledore nodded, although he took a hurried step back as Harry lifted the fang. That wasn't very flattering. It suggested that he thought Harry was going to hit the ring and the fang would go flying. Actually, that wasn't a foolish, though. Harry hurriedly grabbed the fang firmly in both hands. Staring at the ring, he lifted the fang, prepared to slam it down. If you kill me, you are killing yourself, a voice hissed from the locket. It took Harry a moment to realize it was speaking Parseltongue. After all, are we not the anchor that keeps you tethered to this world? How do you know that you won't simply drift away once we are gone? Don't listen to it, Harry, Dumbledore said. It will say anything to survive. The prophecy says that neither of us can truly die so longer as the other lives. Is that not enough to keep us alive? The ring was silent for a moment, then said, You have worked so hard to survive. Don't you want to be immortal? Harry scowled and slammed the fang down. Everything seemed to vibrate around him. He heard a scream of agony that seemed to echo in his head. It was overwhelming, and he fell to the ground, the fang dropping out of his hand. He saw a phantom image, and it lunged toward him, as though it was trying to enter him now that it had been deprived of its true home. As it passed through him, Harry felt his muscles spasm. His back arched, and he was suddenly somewhere else. He saw images in a confusing jumble. He saw a wild-haired woman, her lips looking strangely swollen. She had a sultry look on her face that made Harry vaguely uncomfortable. Mounds of gold, gems, and other artifacts lay everywhere. Finally, he saw Voldemort laughing. His plans were going well, better than he could have hoped. Potter would suffer, Potter would die, and he would be free at last. A moment later, he felt the soul disintegrate, a sensation that filled him with a strange sense of visceral horror. He'd just destroyed part of someone's soul, an act of murder far worse than simply killing someone. From a certain perspective, murder could be seen as simply helping someone along to the next plane of existence. Killing their soul, though, was killing everything they ever were. It was making it as though they had never been, and sending them into the darkness of oblivion. It was a horrible, horrible crime, and yet Harry didn't see any other choice. "Are you all right, Harry?" Dumbledore asked. Harry nodded wearily. "I saw some things," he said finally, "things we have to discuss." Harry continued to be disturbed for the next several days. The crime was Voldemort's. He'd mutilated his own soul beyond all recognition, and he'd murdered multiple people to do it. Still, Harry knew what it was like to fear death, and in a sense the Horcrux had been right. Every Horcrux he destroyed was one less anchor holding him to the world. He would be slowly but surely paving the way for his own inevitable death, especially since as a partial Horcrux himself, it was possible he might have to truly die for it all to be over. Harry found himself fantasizing about various methods to deal with Voldemort without killing him. Petrifying him and dropping him into the ocean was his first plan, which was followed by others. Transforming him into something else and sneaking him onto the American space station was a second, though. Harry doubted that wizards could apparate into space, and he'd heard about one astronaut hitting a golf ball off the space station. Turning him into something able to withstand the forces of a volcano and dropping him into one was a third thought. All of the plans assumed he would be able to overwhelm Voldemort and beat him, and that his followers wouldn't rescue him in the meantime. Destroying the Horcruxes was absolutely necessary, and eventually Harry resigned himself to it. In the meantime, everything else settled back into the pattern it had before. Classes went on as normal, although the Durmstrang students were missing, of course, and his lessons with Moody continued. Hermione's lessons continued as well, and after another 3 weeks with no word from Dumbledore about other Horcruxes, she finally met with him in the Room of Requirement. She'd chosen the room, and for some reason the venue she'd chosen was what had to be the Gryffindor common rooms, at least from the colours and look of the room. It was empty, of course, and he wondered if she'd chosen it as a way to put him off balance. "I've been talking with Moody," Hermione said. Harry felt a sudden sense of anxiety. She wouldn't be bringing it up unless it was something out of the ordinary. There was only one subject he knew of that she could be talking to Moody about, and it was one he had been procrastinating about desperately for a while. "He says I'm ready." Moody didn't know what she was ready for, of course. Harry had made sure that he had no idea of what secret he was planning on sharing with Hermione. For a moment, he wondered if Moody had told her she was ready, when she wasn't simply to find out what the secret was, but he'd had Dumbledore double-check Hermione's occlumency shields, and he'd confirmed Moody's assessment. Harry didn't say anything. He just stared at her mutely. A feeling of heaviness was on his chest, and he felt like it was difficult to breathe. Hermione tapped her foot and scowled. "You promised you'd tell me if I mastered occlumency. I have. Are you going to keep lying to me, or are you finally going to tell me the truth?" He hesitated for a moment, then said, "I think you're going to want to sit down." Chapter 61, Explanation. "It's not easy for me to talk about," Harry said. He was suddenly conscious of the way Hermione was staring at him. They were sitting on opposite ends of a couch that he had to admit was actually more comfortable than the ones in the Slytherin common room. Hermione smiled encouragingly, but that only made it worse. Looking down at his hands, Harry said, "Things have been happening to me for a long time, since before I came to Hogwarts." "The visions," Hermione prompted. Harry shook his head. "In a way, I wasn't entirely truthful." "I could tell," Hermione admitted. "I've known you for years, Harry, and every time this subject comes up, you get all tense and angry-looking." Harry frowned. He hadn't been as good at concealing his emotions as he'd thought. It hadn't been very Slytherin of him. "I doubt anyone else would notice," Hermione rushed to say. "After all, you're usually pretty tense. It's just that you get more tense than usual." She'd been watching him. It made Harry wondered what other things he'd been telegraphing to whoever was observant enough. Was someone in Slytherin making regular reports to their Death Eater parents? Or was it that he tended to let his guard down around Hermione, too much so sometimes? "I've had a secret that I've kept for a long time," Harry said. "One that I've only ever told to Dumbledore, and that only very recently." She stared at him expectantly and didn't say anything. She leaned forward as though she thought he was ready to blurt it out. Harry sighed. Dumbledore thinks that when Voldemort tried to kill me as a baby, part of his soul attached itself to mine. What? Obviously, that wasn't remotely like what she'd been expecting to hear from him. Harry had no idea what she was actually expecting. She'd been working with limited and inaccurate information, so there was no telling what kind of scenarios her fertile mind had come up with. He'd been using really dark magic to anchor himself to the world, using pieces of his soul placed in objects. When he tried to kill me, his soul was fractured enough that part of it split off and lodged inside of me. Hermione looked up at his scar. She stared at it for a moment before looking back down at him. What does that have to do with the ability to see the future? You remember the prophecy, Harry said. It was a statement, and not a question. The prophecy was something that every wizard in Britain knew, and even some who didn't live in Britain. Harry had been asked about it by some of the students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. Hermione nodded. She knew all about the prophecy. She'd probably been studying it since they'd become friends to find a way to get him out of it. Neither of us can die, Harry said, not until certain conditions are fulfilled. As long as the pieces of his soul are out there, Voldemort cannot truly die. As long as I am connected to him, I am anchored here as well. Hermione was silent for a long moment. Glancing at her, Harry thought she looked as though she was choosing her words carefully. Are you saying you are both immortal? Harry remembered what the Horcrux had told him. Could they both become immortal simply by refusing to kill each other? He wasn't sure, and he was afraid to ask Dumbledore for fear that Dumbledore would think he was faltering in his resolve. In different ways, Harry said. If his body is killed, he floats around like a disembodied wraith until he can find a new body to inhabit. What happens to me is somewhat different. Hermione leaned forward even further, far enough that Harry wondered if she was going to fall off the couch. Harry took a deep breath. There wasn't any way to sugarcoat what had been a fact of his life for more than half the time he had lived. I time travel when I die. What? Harry stared at the floor. It was difficult enough to talk about without looking at her. If I die, my spirit travels back in time to an earlier point in my life. I wake up with memories of what happened in the future. He glanced over at her. She was staring at him as though he'd grown 2 extra heads. Are you sure that you aren't just having really vivid visions of the future? Hermione asked. Like what you told me in the first place. Harry shook his head. There aren't any seers in the Potter family line. Even if there were, that's not how prophecy works. They get flashes of images. A lot of times they don't even get to remember what they have said. I remember every last detail. It's not how time travel works either, Harry, Hermione said. She scowled. I was offered a time turner in 3rd year, but I decided it was irresponsible to use it just to take more classes. He'd convinced her that neither divination nor Muggle studies would be worth her time that year. She had since thanked him for it. She would have hated both classes from what Harry understood. Divination seemed mostly like a fraud, and Muggle studies was so full of inaccuracies that she'd have pulled her hair out. Time travel is dangerous, Harry, Hermione said. There was a woman who actually erased people from the timeline just by walking around a few centuries back. For a moment, Harry considered asking her how they'd even figured that out. She'd have certainly looked it up. However, this wasn't really the time. He'd have to remember to ask her later. After all, if the Unspeakables could really know when the timeline had been changed and how, wouldn't they have come after him already? It's not like I have a choice, Harry said. It just happens. Dumbledore agrees with this interpretation? Harry nodded. He was the one that explained it to me. I had no idea why it was happening. I just knew that it had... She was silent for a long moment. How many times? What? Harry asked, although he had a suspicion about what she wanted to know. Hermione looked away from him, staring into the fire. If you've died before, how many times has it happened? Once? Twice? 10 times, Harry said, and there were some close calls on top of that. She didn't speak, but her hands tightened on her lap. She looked away from him and she didn't speak for a long moment. Her entire body looked tense. How? Harry frowned as he thought back. I've been stabbed a couple of times, thrown under a train, crushed by a trolls club, been crucioed and avada kedavraed, had my intestines exploded, killed by a basilisk, crushed to death by a crowd, blew myself up. Oh, and decapitated. How can you be so casual about it? She asked. You talk like it's nothing. It's been happening to me since I was 10, Harry said, and I've been getting better at keeping it from happening. Harry glanced down and saw that she was twisting her robes in her hands, which were tense enough to be almost white. And you remember everything about it? Harry nodded. And it hurts? She asked. Every time, Harry said, except for the Avada Kedavra. That actually wasn't as bad as the others. Hermione laughed. The sound was a little hysterical. She sounded shocked, and she still hadn't looked back at him. Harry found himself wondering just what she was thinking. I guess asking which way is best to die isn't just an academic question for you, she said. Harry shrugged. I keep hoping for, in my sleep of old age, but it doesn't feel like I've ever going to get there. Hermione frowned. How much time? She asked. He knew what she was asking immediately. 2 years, near enough. Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's an entire school year. She stiffened and finally looked at him. Is that how you keep getting ahead of me? Harry found himself grinning at her. It was so much like her. In the middle of talking about death and resurrection, she was outraged about grades. I knew you had to have something, you just aren't that smart. Hermione seemed to realize what she'd just said, and she put her hand to her mouth. It's not that I don't think you are smart, it's just that you always seem to know everything even before the teachers teach it. Nobody is that smart. Tom Riddle had been. That was why Harry had to work twice as hard to be half as good. His only chance was to keep working to catch up until he finally did. Frowning, Hermione said, So you've been reliving the same times over and over again. Doesn't it get boring? Harry nodded emphatically. You think history of magic is bad the first time? Try going through it over again. Even McGonagall, Class and Flitwick's can get pretty boring, and they're the best teachers. It'd drive me crazy, Hermione admitted. I love school. I'd hate to be stuck in class going over things I've already mastered months ago. There's ways to stay occupied, Harry admitted. Adding things to transfigurations while McGonagall isn't looking, changing spells, working on my wandless spells. A lot of it feels like I'm wasting my time, though. I always wondered why someone who didn't seem to like school that much was so good at it. Harry sighed. I'd really rather be like Neville, or even Ron Weasley, not a care in the world, able to just enjoy school and have fun and never worry about anything. Hermione looked down at her hands. I can't believe that I always thought you were just being paranoid. The things you worried about just didn't seem real. I'd been through some of them, and I had enough experience to know what kind of things could happen, Harry said. He hesitated, then admitted, Of course, sometimes I really was paranoid, but you can understand why. She was silent and didn't say anything. Harry wondered what she was thinking. He found himself wondering when he'd see the look he'd been dreading. He didn't want her pity. Her understanding would be enough. Lunging at him, Hermione had wrapped her arms around him before he even had a chance to go for his wand. It took him a startled moment to realize that she was hugging him. It felt awkward. Harry hadn't been touched by the Dursleys except in anger. Teachers had never touched him, and Dudley had ensured that he had never gotten any hugs from other children. Being touched was a rare thing for him, and he wasn't sure how to respond. Where were his hands supposed to go? Was he supposed to hug her back? It took him another moment to relax and realize that it actually felt rather nice. This wasn't like being kissed by Fleur. It was something that friends did, but in many ways it meant more to him that Fleur's kiss. After all, Harry suspected that Fleur probably had no problem kissing people, but he'd never seen Hermione hug anyone other than her parents. Awkwardly, his hands crept up her back, and he began patting it like he'd seen Vernon do when hugging Aunt Marge. The hug seemed to go on for a lot longer than the hugs he'd seen between Vernon and Marge, though. Those were short, almost embarrassed moments that Vernon seemed to think no one should comment on or think about. Given that it was Aunt Marge, Harry did his best not to think about it. Finally it ended, and when Hermione pulled away, Harry was alarmed to see that her eyes looked wet. She sniffed and wiped her eyes with the edge of her robe. "So what are we going to do about it?" she asked. "Well," Harry said slowly, "there's not a lot we can do right now. Unless we can figure out where those anchors are, we can't do anything." The last thing he wanted was to get her involved in the Horcrux hunt. After all, he'd already been decapitated once and killed by a giant basilisk. How much more dangerous would the search for the others be? Hermione frowned. "And there isn't anything you can do to find them?" "We're trying to figure something out," Harry admitted, "but we haven't come up with anything yet." It had the benefit of being true while being somewhat misleading. Harry didn't mention the fact that the diary had been a Horcrux, or that they'd already destroyed another one. Telling her that would only encourage her to want to be included. He didn't need her anywhere in his life where she could get hurt. Telling her he was a Horcrux was even less viable. After all, Harry doubted that Dumbledore would have told him at all if he'd lived in a universe where he didn't reset. Only the knowledge that Harry was intimately connected with death and was older than he looked had made it sensible to tell him. Harry understood that. He wondered if Dumbledore knew that he understood what it really meant. After all, he'd been killed by Voldemort once already, using Quirrell's hand, and another time by Quirrell. It was likely that he wouldn't be able to actually die until the last of the Horcruxes was gone. It was also likely that he would have to die for real in order for the last Horcrux to be destroyed. Harry hadn't asked Dumbledore about the odds that he'd be able to survive because he hadn't wanted to know how poor they were. He suspected that he'd actually been a little depressed about it, although he tried not to think about it too much. It was like that mythological sword he vaguely recalled hearing about, the one hanging over someone's head by a string. No matter how he tried not to think about it, it was there in the back of his mind. Looking at Hermione, she looked a little depressed too. "I'm getting stronger," Harry said. "Practicing every day, and I'm catching up. At the rate I'm going, I'll catch up to him eventually." It would only take about 100 more deaths, but Harry didn't say that to her. After all, she was looking depressed enough. "So what can I do?" Hermione asked. Harry frowned. He wanted to keep her away from danger, but she'd never accept that unless there was a real role she could play. "Research," he said. "Find me spells I can use to defeat the Death Eaters. Be careful about asking questions, though. People can tell what you are looking for by the questions you ask." The last thing he needed was for her to start looking for Horcruxes and be murdered by a Slytherin out looking for favor from the Dark Lord. "I can help find the anchors," Hermione said hesitantly. "No," Harry said. At her expression, he said, "I don't want you to be in danger." He might as well admit it. "And it's all right for you to be in danger?" Hermione asked. She stared at him challengingly. It occurred to him that she really was pretty, even now with her hair frizzy and not made up. She didn't have the makeup on, or the beautiful dress, but somehow she was still beautiful without it. The fact that she hadn't looked at him with pity made him even more beautiful. Harry shrugged. "I'm immortal, more or less. You aren't? And what happened if you know who finds out about all of this?" she asked. At his expression, she stopped. "He knows? There was a thing that happened," Harry said. "He took my blood to recreate his body, and he got taken along for the ride." "Harry," Hermione said, "if he knows you are in more danger than ever." Harry shrugged again. It wasn't anything he could do anything about, and considering that he had been in danger from the day he was born, it didn't really seem to matter much. "He won't kill you," she said. "He'll maim you. Cut off your hands and your tongue, and then he'll stash you someplace." The fact that she'd jumped directly to this conclusion was a sign of the influence he'd had on her. First-year Hermione could not have imagined anything like that. Harry couldn't decide whether to feel proud or sad. "I've already thought of that," Harry said. "There are measures." Obviously her mind was going to the same place as his because the colour drained out of her face. "Harry," she began uncertainly. "It'd be a last resort," Harry said. "But there really are worse things than death, at least for me." He could still remember what it had been like to be crucioed. "There had to be another way," she said. He nodded. "Yeah, don't get caught. That's my main plan. It's been working fairly well so far. I've only actually been captured twice." That was mostly because he'd been murdered on the spot all the other times, but Harry didn't mention that. Hermione shook her head as though she was trying to dislodge an unpleasant thought. For all he knew, she was. "I want to help you look for the anchors," she said. Harry's mind raced. The last thing he needed was for her to blunder around asking questions that would get them all caught. On the other hand, he knew her. She wasn't going to let this go. Besides, she was in the library all the time anyway. No one would question if she was suddenly interested in history. "How about this?" he said. "Find Ravenclaw's diadem for me." There was a flash of light, and a moment later, a door appeared in the wall. It wasn't the door leading back into the hallway outside, and it was open into darkness. He and Hermione stared at each other, wide-eyed. Chapter 62, Diadem. Staring at the door, Harry asked Hermione, "What were you just thinking?" The room always provided what the people inside needed. Harry had been inside before and reached for something only to find it directly under his hand. However, he didn't think it could provide real, unique items like horcruxes. If it could, the room would be far more powerful and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. After all, he'd be able to ask it for nuclear weapons if that were the case. "I was thinking about how I wished I could get it for you right now," Hermione admitted, "so that you could be free." "The room thought it was a request," Harry said quietly. He hesitated. "Maybe I should go in by myself." Hermione stared at him, looking outraged. "You promised that I could be a part of this." "Doing research," Harry said. "There are traps around the horcruxes. I've already died once going after one. I thought you said you didn't know where to go from here." Harry sighed. "We've already destroyed 2, Tom Riddle's diary from second year, and a ring. We don't know where any of the others are, although we think one is a snake that goes with him everywhere he goes." "And when were you going to tell me?" she asked. Harry ignored the question, studying the door. He wouldn't put it past Voldemort to put a trap on the door itself, and he didn't happen to have a book on curse-breaking. "Harry," Hermione's voice sounded cautious. He glanced at her and realized that there was a book on the edge of the sofa. He carefully reached for it, then hesitated. What if this was an undetected horcrux and trapped? The irony of trapping a book about breaking through traps would appeal to Voldemort's sense of irony. "I don't suppose you could run to get Dumbledore," Harry said. "I think we're going to need him." "You can't enter the room while someone else is inside," Hermione reminded him. "We've tried that before. The only way would be to leave the door open, and then anyone walking by could find it." Harry scowled. "Voldemort likes to trap the locations his horcruxes are hidden in, sometimes invisibly. That's how I got beheaded last time." "Couldn't you just reset and stop me?" she asked. Harry shook his head. "I don't have any control over when I come back. If I did, do you think I'd have let Adrian and Colin—" He sighed. "Some things can't be undone, and if I survive and you don't, we might not get a chance to make it right." "How about if I stay at the door?" she said. "That way, if something happens that doesn't kill you, I can run and get help." Harry nodded. It would be just his luck to be petrified and trapped in a room that no one could find again. That would be giving victory to Voldemort by default. Carefully touching the book, he winced as he opened it. Nothing happened, and he began to flip through it. It was completely over his head. He was only a 4th year in arithmancy, and this required math that was far beyond his level. He closed his eyes and wished for an easy curse-breaking book. Opening them, nothing appeared. Harry wasn't certain if this was a limitation of the room or that there was no such thing as an easy curse-breaking book. Reluctantly, he rose to his feet. He had a feeling this was going to hurt. As he approached the door, he took out his wand. "Don't take a single step inside," he said. "The traps could be terrible, and stay on your guard. If something explodes in there, the blast may reach out through the door." She nodded grimly. Harry reached the door, and he pushed it open. He gasped as he looked through it. On the other side was something he could barely comprehend. The room inside was massive, as big at least as the King's Cross station, which was the biggest single room Harry had ever seen before. The ceiling was high, and beams of light shone down from windows that Harry didn't remember ever seeing on the outside of Hogwarts. Was the light an illusion, like the night sky in the Great Hall, or did the room open into someplace else? Harry had read a story once about a magical closet that led children into a magical land with goat people and an evil witch and some kind of candy that he'd always wanted to try. More importantly, the light shone down onto a massive collection of junk that was bigger than any mythological dragon's hoard. It was massive, so large that it had lanes carved through it, because if it hadn't, there would have been no way to pass through what had to be the lost items of 1,000 years of Hogwarts students. There were thousands of books, and Harry wondered immediately if there were any that would be of use to him, perhaps of lost or forbidden magic. More likely, there were probably dozens of copies of the same books. Although he couldn't be certain, this was probably everything that had been lost in Hogwarts, which meant the books would only be those that the students would have had. Of course, Harry had seen some Slytherin students have some nasty books of spells. He decided that if he survived this, he'd go through the books. "Accio diadem," he called out, pushing his wand through the door. Nothing happened. He frowned. If the room was actually in another universe, it might be that his Accio couldn't reach it. If it was in this universe, it was possible that Voldemort had protected it from being summoned. That might be why the room had opened a door, instead of simply summoning the diadem to his couch. Pointing at one of the books, he said, "Accio book," being careful to focus on one particular book. The last thing he needed was a mountain of books to come flying through the door like some kind of avalanche of forgotten schoolwork. Being crushed by classwork would be the most humiliating death yet. The book flew through the air, and Harry caught it, being careful to not step outside the door. Apparently the room existed in their universe, and it was some special property of the diadem that kept it from being found. Harry stared at the massive mounds of trash and forgotten detritus. This was almost as good as his idea about dropping it in the ocean. There was no guarantee that it was at the top of a pile. In fact, as it had been left at least 11 years ago, it was possible that it had already been covered by new detritus. Of course, it would still be near the top of the piles, assuming that Voldemort hadn't intentionally buried it further down inside. It might take months of searching to find it, months that Harry felt deep in his bones that he didn't have. He scowled. The only way to find it was to go inside and look for the traps. The more traps there were, the closer he was getting to his goal. Of course, Voldemort might have chosen to leave no traps at all, trusting on the unlikelihood of anyone finding it to protect it. That didn't sound like him, although there really hadn't been any traps on the diary either. Harry realized that he was going around in circles. His reluctance to enter the room was prompted by fear of whatever horrors awaited. The smart thing to do would be to wait for Dumbledore, even if he had to prop the door open and obliviate anyone who happened to come down the hallway. His worst fear, however, was having this doorway disappear and never reappear again. Harry bent down and checked the book he'd summoned. It was an old copy of a third-year Transfiguration book. Waving his wand, he stepped back, and a moment later the book was transformed into a pig. It wasn't a particularly good job. It still had print running up and down the sides, but it would do for the moment. "Go," Harry said. He watched as the pig wandered aimlessly out into the room. Nothing slashed out at him or seemed to affect him at all. It was possible that some spells only affected humans, but Harry wasn't capable of creating a human analogue, and he suspected that it would upset Hermione if he did. He waved his wand and birds appeared. The flock floated in front of him, and a moment later he took a deep breath and stepped out into the room. The birds were spread out enough that he would be able to notice if there were any trip lines or other invisible traps. Of course, it was possible that they would actually set some of them off, which meant he had to stay on his guard. He'd have to see if he could get special classes on curse breaking sometime in the future. Of course, that might clue everyone in on what he was doing, so it might not be at Hogwarts. This place really was like a cathedral. Harry noticed it immediately as he stepped into it. It had that same sense of age and majesty. Every other part of Hogwarts was presumably just as old, but they were actually lived in on a day-to-day basis. However, this was a place that had not seen other human beings often. Harry wondered if the house elves had been depositing things here, or if it was a function of the castle itself. How did the castle know things were lost and not simply set down for a while? The pig in front of him suddenly screamed and burst into flames. Harry gestured, and it returned to book form. He sent a quick blast of water after it. The last thing he wanted to do was set fire to this room. With this much fuel, a fire here might burn down the entire castle. What had Tom been thinking? He sent the birds flying through the space where the pig had been. The entire flock burst into flames and disappeared as they flew through the area the pig had walked through. Harry looked back and saw that Hermione was staring through the doorway, her face as white as a ghost. If anything good came of this, it would be convincing Hermione of just how dangerous all this was. If it kept her safe, he would be satisfied. Of course, he had to survive so that this moment became set in time instead of erasing every moment he'd developed with her. He sent flock after flock of birds through the space. The first 4 flocks burned and died, but the magic dwindled, and by the 7th flock it vanished entirely. Harry suspected that Voldemort wouldn't have had time to trap this place the way he would have liked. After all, the diary had been his first horcrux when he had been a student, but Dumbledore seemed to think the others had been created when he was an adult. There probably hadn't been a lot of time to set traps if he was here for some other purpose. Harry could only hope that was true. Harry heard Hermione gasp as he stepped through the spot that had killed so many of his animals. The thought of finding a different path had occurred to Harry, but there was no guarantee that those paths would be any less trapped than this one. Besides, if it was trapped, there was a good chance that this was the right way. After all, if Voldemort hadn't had a lot of time, he wouldn't have bothered trapping false trails. Harry created another pig from a nearby book. This one was a little better than the last, with less print running over its skin. While the birds were good, it was possible that some spells were triggered by weight. No point in killing house elves if they were the ones delivering things here after all. That might alert people that something was actually here worth worrying about. What complicated everything was that he didn't just need to look for traps. He had to look for the diadem as well. He could only hope that it was somehow miraculously on the top of the pile. The only thing that helped in that respect was that 12 or even 20 years was only a drop in the bucket compared to the age of this pile, and the size of the pile meant that the odds of any particular object being covered in that time was relatively slim. His eyes darted back and forth as he made his deliberate way through the pathway. Everything was growing dark now. Harry didn't know if a cloud passed over the sun or if he was simply passing through parts of the stacks where the light didn't pass as well. He heard a sound from up ahead. He'd lost sight of the pig as it turned the corner. Turning the corner, he stopped abruptly. The pig was lying on the ground ahead, mysteriously dead. Harry sent the birds flying through the space the pig had been, and nothing happened. Had it been a spell that ended once triggered, or was there something there that he couldn't see? Or had Voldemort left a guardian of some kind, one that was watching him even now? Harry felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise at the thought. He imagined something waiting on top of the piles, waiting to drop down on him. Human beings rarely looked up, which made up the best direction to launch an attack. A glint of light shone off as something up ahead. Even with his glasses, Harry had to squint a bit, and he still couldn't tell. He cast a supersensory charm. If there was something living waiting for him, he'd be able to tell by its breathing. He'd be able to see what was up ahead, at least. Harry felt the familiar sudden rush as all of his senses were expanded 1,000 times. He could suddenly hear Hermione behind him at the door. Her heart was racing, and her breathing was quick and labored. She was worried for him. His own pulse would have been overpowering, but he'd learned how to tune it out. There was no other sounds in the room except for the flapping of birds' wings. No watcher then, or at least none living. He could see what he'd been looking for bow. It was a battered old tiara at the top of a pile. A trick of the light had alerted him to it. Harry felt a certain sense of foreboding. If he walked through the space his pig had been killed, he wasn't sure that sending any number of pigs through would be wise. The only alternative was either climbing up on the stacks to avoid the path, trying the other paths as a way to work his way around, or AUR. Harry grinned. He waved his wand, and the flock of birds floating in front of him surged forward. They seemed unmolested by whatever traps Tom Riddle had set on this, the last stretch before reaching the goal. They reached the diadem, and the first two that touched it blackened and died. The others, however, grabbed onto it, and they just barely managed to carry it back toward Harry. He knew better than to touch it. The memory of that lingering blackness surging up Dumbledore's hand was fresh in his memory as Harry conjured a sack to put it in. As they dropped the diadem in the sack, he levitated the sack and sent it out before him. Dismissing the supersensory charm, he carefully retraced his steps back to the doorway. Hermione was waiting for him there, an expression of anxiety on her face. He'd stepped out of her view, but she'd followed his instructions and hadn't stepped into the room. Harry was glad. He had no doubt that she'd have gone after Dumbledore if something had happened to him. If he'd been petrified or stopped in some way that hadn't killed him, it would have been his only chance. If Voldemort had known about his ability when he'd set the traps years before, he'd have undoubtedly have created some non-lethal traps like that. Something that transfigured him into a book or a bone or something would have been remarkably effective. In the middle of that monstrous pile, no one would have found him. It was a literal ocean of trash, or at least a very large lake, and he'd have been gone forever. "Is that it?" Hermione asked, staring at the bag. Harry nodded. Magically dropping the bag onto a couch, he carefully let the sides of the bag drop. The diadem sat in the middle of the couch. It looked like an old, tarnished piece of jewelry. Hermione took a step toward it, and Harry put his hand on his arm. "It's not safe to touch," Harry said. "One of these almost killed Dumbledore in a future that didn't happen or passed, or, well, during one of the resets. There wasn't really any good way of talking about things that hadn't happened in what had once been the future, but now were in the past." "I can hear it calling to me," Hermione said in a low voice. "Is it always like that?" "Don't listen to it," Harry said sharply. "It will lie to you or do whatever it takes to survive." She frowned. "It's telling me that you are only using me, that you'll abandon me the minute you don't have any use for me." "I think it's time you go and get Dumbledore," Harry said. "I'll leave the door open." "What if someone comes down the corridor?" she asked. "I'll obliviate them," Harry said. Hermione looked shocked, but Harry didn't see that he had a choice. Walking through the hallways with a floating bag would be even more conspicuous. He could cover it with his invisibility cloak, but he had to worry that it had contaminated somehow. "I care about you," Harry reassured Hermione, "and even when this is all over, we'll still be friends. I'm not using you. Now, will you go and get Dumbledore? Make sure you aren't overheard." She stared at him, then glanced over at the diadem on the couch for a moment. She nodded, and a moment later a door opened in the wall. Harry stepped over to the door and saw her retreating down the hall at a good pace. He was left alone with the object holding the spirit of his enemy. Chapter 63. Whispers. As Harry stood at the doorway watching for Hermione and Dumbledore to return, he thought he heard whispers in the back of his mind. He glanced back at the couch where the diadem still sat. It looked innocuous, like any old piece of jewelry, but Harry knew better. It had spoken to Hermione in her mind, and he hadn't even heard it, which meant it was potentially more dangerous than some of the other horcruxes had been. Whispering echoed, and Harry hurriedly looked out the door. He couldn't see anyone, but some of the older students were capable of casting disillusionment spells. Were there more than one of them out there? The older Slytherins were out to get him. He'd always known it, but somehow it hadn't seemed to bother him as much in the past. It hadn't occurred to him to wonder just how much information they were sending home. Were they talking about what he was doing, what he was planning? Were they going through his things? He'd made certain elementary precautions, of course, but for every defensive magic there was an even better way to overcome it. After all, Dumbledore had managed to break through the best defences Voldemort had in less than 30 minutes. What chance did spells he have in third year to keep anyone out? A noise out in the hallway. Harry pulled his cloak on and peered out the door. He still didn't see anything, which frustrated him. People who had disillusioned themselves could be anywhere. He brightened, pointing his wand out into the hallway and casting Homininum Revello. Learning the spell for situations just like these had been a wise decision. Assassins could be around every corner, and knowing they were there could be the difference between life and death. Harry frowned as the spell revealed nothing. Had someone found a way to counteract the spell? Or was whatever outside not human? There were creatures that the spell wouldn't reveal: house elves, goblins, merpeople. Considering that every pureblood house seemed to have their own house elves, it is surprising they weren't used more often for assassination. Conventional wards didn't stop them from appearing where they wished, and their magic was quite strong. He glanced back at the diadem. The room had thankfully closed the door to the room with its mountains of trash. The last thing Harry needed was to have to watch his back while watching out the door. Another sound, and his head whipped around again. There was something here. He was sure of it. Perhaps the problem was that whoever it was had already left the hall and was in the room with him. He whipped around, casting the human revealing spell again. Nothing, but the room seemed darker than it had before somehow. The room provided whatever those inside needed. Keeping the room fully lit probably would attract attention. At his sudden realization, the lights dimmed. The sun was setting outside anyway, and the fire in the fireplace disappeared, turning into smouldering coals. He needed to be prepared for anything. It was frustrating. No matter how hard he worked, he'd never be a match for Voldemort. He didn't have the magical skills, and worse, he didn't have the intelligence. Voldemort had been a prodigy from the time he was young. People thought Harry was a prodigy, but only because he'd been cheating for a long time. Voldemort had all the advantages. He had an army. He was the second most powerful man in Wizarding Britain. They were both immortal, more or less, but he didn't have to keep starting from scratch. What Harry needed was an edge, something that would allow him to match Voldemort's intelligence, or even exceed it. He glanced back at the diadem. It didn't look like much, but it had supposedly been enchanted by Rowena Ravenclaw to increase its wearer's intellect. The spells to do that had been lost with her, and no one else had recreated them. The diadem was old, but it had a power that would never fade. What was it like to have the intelligence of a Voldemort, or a Dumbledore, or even a Hermione? To always be 3 steps ahead of everyone around you, able to think so far ahead that other people might as well not even play. The diadem could offer him that. It could be the edge he needed in the battle against Voldemort. Harry realized suddenly that he'd stepped away from the door. There was some reason that he was supposed to guard the door, but he couldn't quite remember why. After all, wasn't defeating Voldemort much more important than guarding a door leading to a corridor that hardly anyone ever used anyway? He took another couple of steps toward the diadem. The diadem wasn't the only artifact that had power. There were others that were reputed to give the wearer powers unknown to others. The Resurrection Stone wasn't just the sentimental piece of claptrap he'd thought it was. Dumbledore desired it for military reasons. The ability to question enemies after they were dead alone would be of inestimable value. Perhaps he could even question Rowena Ravenclaw or Salazar Slytherin themselves. With the intellect granted by the diadem, he might even be able to use the stone to learn other secrets from the Founders. He'd have to get the stone from Dumbledore first, of course, and the wand. He'd looked up the wand after Dumbledore had showed it to him. It was supposed to be the most powerful wand in the world. How much it contributed to Dumbledore's edge over Voldemort, Harry couldn't say. He needed the wand and the stone. With those and the diadem, he'd be able to stop Voldemort and restore the world to the way it ought to be. With them, he'd be able to beat Voldemort, and he'd be the most powerful wizard in the world. He'd be able to get back at the people who'd been tormenting him for most of his life. He'd use the pensieve to find whoever had pushed him off the train. He'd use it to find the Death Eaters who had stabbed him outside of Diagon Alley. He'd kill them all. It was the only way he'd ever be safe. Harry blinked as he realized that he was somehow leaning over the couch, reaching for the diadem. The fact that he didn't really remember walking across the room should have bothered him, but somehow it didn't seem particularly important. After all, he was about to take the first step toward greatness, the very greatness the Sorting Hat had promised him. His hand reached out to touch the diadem, but the memory of Dumbledore's hand turning black was suddenly at the forefront of his mind. He'd thought Dumbledore was a fool, but had he been somehow influenced into putting the ring on? Dumbledore was manipulative sometimes, and he sometimes trusted too much in people's better natures, but he was rarely stupid. Everything seemed darker all of a sudden, darker than he'd asked the room to turn. Harry would have blamed the sun, but it had already set. He blinked. It shouldn't have set for several minutes yet. It should have still been twilight. Was the room creating nighttime conditions, or had he been standing here in a daze for longer than he would have thought? Now that he thought about it, the Gryffindor common room didn't look nearly as accommodating as he'd initially thought. The whole place was done in red and gold. The red somehow seemed deeper in the darkness, and it reminded him of the sight of blood. The Slytherin dorms were more comforting, the coolness of water, the beauty of an unseen world that none of the other students got to see. Anyone could see the view the Gryffindors had. All they had to do was step outside. For all he knew, there could be secret doors riddling this place. The entire castle was lousy with them, and he didn't trust the Marauder's map to reveal all of them. Harry suspected that the map only showed the places his father and his friends had known about. Harry realized that he was reaching for the diadem again, and he snatched his hands away. Ultimate power, but at what price? He took a step away from the couch, and after a moment he headed back for the door. He needed to do something at the door, even if he couldn't remember quite what it was. It was tiring, standing at the door. He couldn't even remember why he was there, and nothing had moved outside. If he was worried about something getting in, wouldn't the smart thing be to make the door disappear? It wouldn't appear for someone outside if it was occupied, and there wasn't any way that anyone could get inside. Even if they could somehow get around the anti-apparition wards, they'd be jumping in blind, which they couldn't do. Harry looked back and started when he realized that the Gryffindor common room had vanished. In its place was the Slytherin dungeons. He had been feeling uncomfortable with how sinister the former room had been, but he couldn't quite remember consciously changing the setting. It might be for the best, though. He'd be able to slip up into his own bed and for the first time be able to sleep secure in the knowledge that no one could come for him. It would be the first time in years where he'd be able to sleep peacefully. He remembered a story told in his last year of Muggle school. It was something about a giant that held up the sky. It was a punishment from the King of the Gods for something Harry really didn't remember. What he did remember was the thought of having to hold an enormous weight forever, never getting to rest. Harry had been holding the weight of the world on his own shoulders for more than half of his life, at least out of the years he could remember. Wasn't it right that he set his burden aside and finally rest? Blinking, Harry realized that he was standing over the couch again. He'd been ruminating and hadn't even realized that he'd been walking toward it. He reached down for the diadem, and then he stopped. This wasn't like him, not at all. He'd thought Dumbledore the most stupid man in the world for putting on a ring that he knew was probably trapped, and now he was about to do the same thing with his head. Harry slammed his occlumency shields up, and he gasped as he suddenly felt his mind clear. He always had a certain amount of shields up. It was part of the training, but apparently the diadem had been able to worm its way past those. It was insidious, and Harry suspected that it wouldn't have been as powerful or obvious in the presence of others. After all, when it had someone alone, it could focus all its energies on their mind. When it was among multiple people, it had to be more subtle. Giving in to it would have been so easy, and it would have seemed like his own idea the entire time. Someone like Hermione, who had no shields at all, would have been affected even more quickly. "Harry?" Hermione asked. She was standing at the doorway looking at the Slytherin motif. Dumbledore was standing behind her. Considering that she'd been expecting him to be waiting at the door, not standing over the diadem staring at it, he could understand her confusion. "Miss Granger tells me you have had a fortuitous accident," Dumbledore said. As they stepped into the room, the door vanished behind them, presumably at Dumbledore's will. Dumbledore walked over to stand beside Harry, staring down at the diadem on the couch. "These can be remarkably persuasive," he said softly. Harry didn't meet his eyes. He felt ashamed for thinking Dumbledore stupid or for thinking he'd do a lot better. He had, but in part because he'd had the memory of what had happened to Dumbledore to remind him of why using the Horcrux was stupid. It preyed on fears and insecurities he'd barely been aware of having, of not being good enough or smart enough. It fed his natural paranoia. Talking directly to Hermione had been a master stroke. Harry had been assuming it would do the same to him, and he'd have been prepared for that. Harry wondered if it had actually intended to manipulate her, or if it had simply been laying the groundwork for what it was trying with him. "It's vicious," Harry said. He glanced over at Hermione, who looked pale, and he wondered if it was talking to her again. It needed to be taken care of, and quickly. Dumbledore glanced at him, and then he pulled out the box. He put on a dragonskin glove, and a moment later he pulled out the fang. A moment after that he stabbed down. The diadem screamed, and a vicious black cloud rose from it. It hissed and writhed, and it screamed out at Hermione. "He will never love you. In the end, he will only betray you." It came rushing at Harry, as though it was seeking a refuge now that the object anchoring it to the world was gone, but it was too late. It shrieked in pain, and a moment later it was gone. Hermione was as white as a sheet. She'd never seen a Horcrux destroyed before, and he'd protected her from some of the more difficult parts of his life. Had he done her a service, or had he made her weaker than she would have otherwise been? What could he say to her to reassure her? Someone who was planning to betray someone else would surely claim that they weren't. Lying was an integral part of betrayal. "Harry has shown great trust in you today, Miss Granger," Dumbledore said from behind him, "and I think he does not trust easily." Harry glanced back at Dumbledore gratefully. 100 years of diplomacy was probably useful in these situations. Harry had never been particularly good at talking to girls. He had only been able to talk to Hermione because he'd rarely seen her as a girl. The fact that this was changing now made him a little uncomfortable. "I am concerned, however," Dumbledore continued. Harry glanced back at Dumbledore again, and at the expression on his face he took an involuntary step back. "We are involved in something upon which rests the fate of all of Wizarding Britain," Dumbledore said. "And should Voldemort or his followers learn what we are doing, everything will be lost." Hermione didn't say anything, just staring up at the headmaster. "Harry here has chosen to put the fate of the entire wizarding world on your shoulders," Dumbledore said, "which is a massive burden that most twice your age would not be prepared to undertake." Harry frowned. Was there a note of censure in Dumbledore's tone? It was a massive risk. Every person that knew what was happening was one more person who could leak the secret. They didn't even have to mean to do it. A simple slip of the tongue or influence via veritaserum would do the trick, or darker, torture should she be caught and interrogated. "The question that has to be asked is whether that trust was misplaced," Dumbledore said. "Is this a burden that is too much for you to bear?" Harry had an uneasy feeling that he knew what was coming. If Hermione hadn't been as advanced in occlumency as she was, he suspected that Dumbledore would have obliviated her already. However, obliviation was of uncertain efficacy against a skilled occlumens. There was a good chance that the spell either wouldn't work or that it wouldn't last, at least if Hermione had her shields up. "Perhaps it would be better if you didn't have this burden," he continued. "Safer for everyone involved." Hermione wasn't slow by any means. Harry could see the moment she realized what he was implying. Her body stiffened and her eyes widened. "I would never betray Harry," she blurted out. "The Death Eaters can be very persuasive," Dumbledore said, "sometimes using methods that are unpleasant to say the least." "They won't know to ask the questions if you do your part right," Hermione said. Dumbledore was silent. "You aren't concerned about the danger this puts you in?" "I've been in danger from the minute I stepped on the train to Hogwarts," Hermione said. "I'm a Muggle-born who is one of Harry Potter's only friends. How much more danger could I possibly be in?" Harry suspected that Hermione had dismissed that danger throughout much of their friendship. Only recently had it begun to feel real to her. The fact that she had chosen to stand beside him, even though she actually understood what it could mean for her, meant more to him than he would ever admit. "You are certain about this?" Dumbledore asked. He glanced at Harry. "It would not be difficult to take this burden from you and allow you to live the sort of life a child at Hogwarts should live, free of worries." "No one is free of worries these days," Hermione said. "They just don't talk about it much. I hear people talking about the things they read in the paper. They wonder if they are going to have to fight when they get older, or even if they are going to get older." Harry had been too self-absorbed to notice, but now that he thought about it, there had been an undercurrent of anxiety among his fellow students. "They shouldn't have to worry about such things. No one can put their heads in the sand," Hermione said, "and if there is something I can do to help keep everyone safe, I want to do it. I want to fight to make the world a better place." Dumbledore stared at her for a long moment, as though he was weighing his options. Finally he said, "All right, Miss Granger, but should you change your mind, my door is always open." Harry glanced back at the diadem. They'd destroyed the ring, the diary, and the diadem. 3 more to go.